Well, Pat, it's great to have you joining us. I think this might be your first time on audio, and for anybody that reads any of Pat's page one or economic commentary or just overall market commentary, you're well aware that he's a pretty savvy guy. He's arguably the best writer on the site, and really is tuned in and knows what's going on in the market. So it's a pleasure to have you join us here, Pat. Breaking into everything here, why don't you give us your initial take on these Fed minutes?
Right. Well,
or the Fed statement, I should say.
Sure. Well, I think the market really speaks for me. You can see on the initial reaction anyway that it was not necessarily happy with what it heard. I think in totality, what we got from the Federal Reserve today in the directive, as well as the summary of projections for the economy and interest rates, was that it was really not as dovish as market participants had hoped it would be. And obviously, you had the market running up in front of this decision, and so I think you saw a little bit of that speculative froth taken out on the first blush pass of the release of the minutes, not the minutes, but the directive.
All right. Was there anything that was sticking out to you in particular? Anything that caught you off guard?
Yeah. So I did post a comment under TalkX on the in-play, highlighted four factors that initially jumped out at me. The first was just that the opening paragraph of today's directive was very nearly the same as the one we got in November. And kind of what that implies to the market is that while the market has been trading in a manner that would suggest it's greatly concerned about a slowdown in economic growth, the perspective of the Fed is that it doesn't appear as if it thinks a whole lot has changed. And I think that stuck out as market participants read that opening to the directive. Second factor, I think, is that the market had been hopeful going into this. There had been some chatter anyway. The market was hopeful that the Fed might actually remove its language about the need for having further gradual rate increases, and it didn't really do that. What we saw in the directive was that it still sees. It judges that some further gradual increases in the target range will be consistent with a sustained expansion of economic activity. So again, it's not necessarily backing down from its desire to, I think, get some more insurance in its back pocket in the event we run into a much period of slower growth, if not an actual recession. And maintaining that language in there, I think, provides a reminder for the market that this is not the same Fed that had been grown accustomed to dealing with over recent years. Also, the dot plot projection shows a modest downgrade in the rate hike outlook for 2019 from 3 potential rate hikes to 2. Again, that was something that I think that the market was seemingly thinking that it would get, but it was going to be a real big leap of faith, I think, for the Fed to go from 3 rate hikes down to 1, and certainly to none, to match what the Fed funds futures market is currently thinking, and that is one of the bothersome considerations here. So I think that the market has some spin to interpret this as still somewhat of a hawkish stance relative to what the Fed funds futures market is thinking, and that being that they're not going to get any rate hikes in 2019. And then finally, it was probably an outlier, a marginal expectation or hope that the Fed might dial back some of its quantitative tightening, and that didn't happen. The Fed basically is continuing to scale back. Will continue to scale back. $50 billion per month. So even though if you had a Fed that took a pause for a while, you're still going to see that liquidity come out with its quantitative tightening efforts, and that will be a de facto tightening of financial conditions as that happens. And I think so we put it all together, and I think that the market's knee-jerk response here is understandable, and obviously it's something we're going to have to work our way through here as we move into year-end.
All right, let me ask you a quick question. Do you pay any attention to that long run rate as sort of a North Star for what the neutral rate the Fed thinks should be, or there are stars, they'll refer to it as well? Do you ever use that at all, or do you not really worry too much about that?
Well, you got to pay attention to it, but just by virtue of the fact that it's a long-run rate and the future is inherently uncertain. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen next month, let alone over the next 2 or 3 years. So it's a target, it's a talking point. It's something that the Fed will try to manage. But what we've heard from Fed Chairman Powell and others is that this Fed is going to be increasingly data dependent. So what you see today in the longer-run rate could be entirely different a year or two from now based on unfolding economic conditions. But as it stands right now, it's lower than what it has been throughout history, which in this current cycle leads the market to think that we are perhaps getting closer to that so-called neutral rate, and that there might not be a lot more rate hike activity. But really, I kind of do discount it, knowing that the Fed's forecasting track record hasn't been all that great as it relates to the economy, and knowing clearly that no one can predict the future that far out.
All right, let me ask you, we're about 6 minutes away now from Powell taking the microphone. What are some of the things you're going to be looking for on this call that could perhaps maybe change your thought process on this being a little bit more dovish than was expected, or even hawkish, or just in general? What do you think the key questions will be for Powell in a couple minutes here?
Well, I think one question that will be asked and probably won't be answered is whether what President Trump has been saying has had any effect on his thinking.
Well, we know there's a tweet coming, right?
Right. And so he'll certainly downplay the idea that there's any type of political sway in what the Fed is doing, and and I think that what transpired today and what we've seen thus far is that does drive home the point that this Fed is not going to be swayed by President Trump's directives. But as an aside, if I can add here, I know I'm not answering the question directly, but I think what could ultimately become a concern for this market, if you get another swoon here based off of what's happening today and what the Fed did and what it's saying, you're going to start getting, I think, a pickup in speculation that President Trump will try to find some way to remove Fed Chair Powell from office. Now, whether he can legally do that, I frankly don't know, but it's something that's going to add to this vortex of uncertainty that has gripped this market, not just surrounding monetary policy, but the vortex of uncertainty that includes trade, politics, and growth, and ultimately the direction of interest rates and earnings estimates, and that'll be a problem here. So that'll be one question. I think that questioners are going to get to Powell to help really expand more on what the thinking was at the table, even though there was a slight downgrade to in the rate hike projection for 2019, and try and maybe perhaps draw out of him whether whether the thinking was a little bit more conservative minded than what the dot plot is actually suggesting at this point. But I would expect him to continue to emphasize the point that the Fed's going to be very data dependent, and that it will act as it sees fit based on the incoming data.
All right. Last question for you, Brett, then if you have anything for him. Pat, when you're writing page one tomorrow, what are some of the things that you're going to be focusing on in terms of reaction to the statement to try to gauge the market sentiment around these, both the statement, the outlook, and the Powell presser?
Well, what I try to do is try not to read a whole lot into the initial reaction off of a Fed decision. Now, I think it's easy to kind of analyze what's going on right now at this point in time, but you kind of want to let the dust settle here and maybe not react so much to this one directive right at the moment. But, something that's been weighing on my mind today, irrespective of what we heard from the Fed, is the guidance you heard out of FedEx and Micron, right? Two companies, well-known, widely held, global operations, both citing, weaker than expected demand as a driver of disappointing guidance as they look ahead, and I think that really kind of drove home that while the market's so caught up in what the Fed's doing here, that I think it does validate these concerns about a slowdown in economic growth. And of course, the transports and the semiconductors have been, in a way, foreshadowing that for a good part of this year. And so now the rubber's hitting the road here, and I think you're likely to hear more warnings out of both sectors in coming months that are going to pique these concerns, or at least breathe some life into this idea that the market, while looking more attractively valued these days, isn't being bought up in earnest because of the likelihood that 2019 earnings estimates are still subject to downward revisions. So there's not a lot of faith yet in this lower PE multiple that we've seen result from this sharp sell-off since October. So that's something I'll probably be dwelling on as I think about tomorrow's narrative.
Yeah, no, all good points. Brett, do you got anything for Pat here?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with basically every single thing that he said. One thing I would add is I got long the market a few minutes ago, yes. And the reason is because we didn't get much, what I would say, that we didn't get much sugar in the statement, which means there's no question something will have to be acknowledged here, that the market needs some comfort, so we're probably going to get a load of sugar in the press conference. And so just basically the reaction to not getting a lot of support from the statement is, I believe, going to be a repositioning right into the press conference.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. I like that call. All right, well, speaking of which, we got Powell in about 1 minute that we're going to be going off and covering that. Pat, anything left to add?
No, that's it. I think I wish you well trading the market right here, and I like Brett's perspective.
All right, perfect. All right, well, Pat, thanks a lot for joining us. It's much appreciated.
Sure thing.
Thanks, Pat.
Sure, thanks, guys.